Ladies and gentlemen, most people think silence means you're hurt, that you're weak, that you don't have anything left to say. But the truth is, silence is a decision. It's a conscious choice to step back, to stop giving your energy to someone who already made it clear they didn't value it the way you deserve. And when you make that choice, everything changes. Because now, instead of trying to convince someone to see your worth, you start living like you already know it. See, when someone rejects you, the natural instinct is to respond. You want to explain yourself, defend yourself, maybe even change their mind. You start thinking about what you could have said differently, what you could have done better, how you could have been more this or less that. And before you know it, you're pouring more and more of yourself into a situation where the other person already pulled back. That's where most people lose their power. That's where most people lose their power. Not in the rejection itself, but in the reaction that follows it. But when you go silent, you interrupt that entire cycle. You don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you chase. You don't give them the comfort of knowing they still have emotional access to you. You don't give them the reassurance that they can come and go as they please while you stay right there waiting. Instead, you create distance, and that distance does something powerful. It forces them to feel your absence, because let's be real, when you were present, you were bringing something into their life. Your attention, your energy, your presence, your care. Even if they didn't fully appreciate it at the time, they were still experiencing it. And when you remove that without a scene, without drama, without begging or pleading, it hits differently. It's not loud, but it's heavy. It lingers. It sits with them in moments they didn't expect. Your silence becomes a mirror. It reflects their decision right back at them. But now without your voice softening it, without your effort trying to fix it, they're left alone with what they chose. And for a lot of people, that's uncomfortable. Because as long as you're talking, as long as you're explaining, as long as you're reacting, they don't have to fully face the consequences of what they did. Your presence makes it easier for them to move on without thinking too deeply. But your silence takes that away. And here's the part most people don't understand. Silence is not about punishing them. It's about protecting you. It's about protecting you. It's about drawing a line and saying, I'm not going to keep investing in a place where I'm not valued. It's about refusing to shrink yourself just to fit into someone else's temporary interests. It's about choosing your dignity over your desire to be chosen. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop negotiating your worth. You stop trying to make someone understand why you're valuable, because you've already decided that you are. And that shift, that internal decision, is what gives your silence its power. It's not empty. It's full of self-respect. It's full of clarity. It's full of boundaries that don't need to be announced because they're being lived. Because they're being lived. And the thing is, people notice that. Not always immediately, but they do. Because silence creates space. And in that space, their thoughts start getting louder. They start replaying conversations. They start remembering moments. They start questioning whether they made the right decision. Because now there's no new information coming from you. No messages, no updates, no emotional reactions. Just quiet. And that quiet leaves room for reflection. When you were speaking, you were filling that space. Now that you're silent, they have to fill it themselves. And what they fill it with is often realization. Realization of what they have. Realization of how you handle things. Realization of the difference between someone who chases and someone who walks away with dignity. And that realization doesn't come because you told them. It comes because you didn't. There's a different kind of strength in not needing the last word, in not needing to prove your point, and not needing to be understood by someone who already showed you they weren't willing to see you fully. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in your actions, in your absence, in your ability to move forward without dragging the past behind you. And let's not confuse silence with suppression. You're allowed to feel, you're allowed to process, you're allowed to hurt. But you don't have to broadcast all of that to the person who walked away. Your healing doesn't require their audience. Your growth doesn't depend on their validation. Your growth doesn't depend on their validation. And your silence becomes the space where all of that transformation happens. Because while they're trying to figure out what your silence means, you're figuring out yourself. You're redirecting your energy. You're rebuilding your confidence. You're remembering who you were before you started trying to fit into someone else's expectations. And that's where the real power is. Not in making them regret you, but in outgrowing the version of you that needed them to choose you in the first place. And that's what makes your silence so impactful. It's not just the absence of words. It's the presence of self-worth. It's the decision to walk away without turning back. It's the refusal to beg for a place where you were only tolerated. It's the understanding that your value doesn't decrease just because someone failed to recognize it. Because the moment you stop chasing validation from the person who rejected you is the moment you start reclaiming your power in a way that no explanation ever could. Men are used to reactions. They're used to seeing emotion, hearing questions, feeling the weight of someone trying to hold on. When a man pulls away or rejects a woman, there's often an expectation attached to that decision. He expects a response, maybe not always consciously, but it's there. He expects you to ask why, to express how you feel, to push back, to show him that he mattered enough to disrupt your peace. That expectation gives him a sense of control over the situation. Because as long as you're reacting, he knows exactly where you stand. And that's where most people unknowingly give their power away. They step into that expectation without realizing it, pouring emotion into someone who has already taken a step back. They ask questions that won't be answered honestly. They try to fix something that the other person has already decided to let go of. They keep talking, hoping that the right words will change the outcome, not realizing that the more they speak, the more predictable they become. But when you choose silence, you break that pattern completely. You step outside of what he expected from you. You don't ask why. You don't argue. You don't try to convince him that he made a mistake. You don't show him desperation or confusion. Instead, you give him nothing. And that nothing becomes something he can't ignore. Because now, instead of understanding exactly how you feel, he's left guessing. And people are uncomfortable when they can't read a situation, especially when they thought they could. Your silence introduces uncertainty. It creates a gap between what he expected and what actually happened, and that gap is where confusion begins to grow. He starts to wonder why you didn't react the way he thought you would. He replays the moment, thinking maybe he misjudged you. He underestimated your strength. Maybe he thought you would chase, and now that you didn't, the entire narrative he had in his mind starts to shift because your silence doesn't give him confirmation. It doesn't give him closure. It doesn't give him anything to hold on to. And that's where curiosity enters the picture. Confusion always leads to curiosity when there's no clear answer. He starts to think about you more than he expected to, not because you're reaching out, but because you're not. Not because you're trying to stay on his mind, but because your trying has created space for his thoughts to expand. He checks his phone, wondering if your message. He thinks about what you might be doing, who you might be talking to, how you're handling everything. And the more he doesn't know, the more his mind fills in the blanks. That's the power of silence. That's the power of silence. It doesn't tell a story, it lets the other person create one. And most of the time, the story they create is heavier than anything you could have said. Because when someone can't read you, they start projecting their own thoughts and emotions onto you. If he expected you to be hurt, he might start imagining you moving on instead. If he thought you would chase, he might start wondering why you didn't. And that shift, that moment where his expectations no longer match reality, is where his sense of control begins to slip. Control isn't always about dominating a situation. Sometimes it's about predictability. As long as he can predict your behavior, he feels comfortable, he knows how to respond. He knows what to expect. But your silence removes that predictability. It puts him in a position where he doesn't know what comes next. And that lack of certainty forces him to pay attention in a way he didn't before. Now he's not just moving on. Now he's thinking. Now he's analyzing. Now he's questioning. And those irons don't come with easy answers because you didn't give him any. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't react emotionally. You didn't try to hold on. You simply stepped back. And that simplicity is what makes it so powerful. And over time, that curiosity can turn into something deeper. Because the more he thinks about it, the more he starts to reflect on his own actions. He starts to revisit the connection, the conversations, the moments you shared. He starts to compare your silence to the reactions he's seen before. And when your response stands out as different, it leaves a stronger impression. People don't always remember what was said, but they remember how something made them feel. And your silence creates a feeling he didn't expect. It challenges his assumptions. It disrupts his comfort. It forces him to confront the situation without the usual emotional cues that make things easier to process. And that's where regret can begin to form. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually. It builds in the background, in those quiet moments when he realizes that something about you was different. Something about the way you handled things didn't fit into the patterns he was used to. And that difference starts to matter, because now it's not just about the rejection. It's about what came after it. It's about the fact that you didn't chase, didn't beg, didn't try to change his mind. It's about the fact that you respected yourself enough to walk away without needing his validation. And that realization hits deeper than any argument ever could. Your silence becomes a statement. Even though you never said a word, it tells him that you're not someone who stays where they're not chosen. It tells him that you don't need to prove your worth to someone who couldn't see it. It tells him that you value yourself enough to let go without resistance. And the more he sits with this, the more it challenges his perception of you, because now he has to reconcile the version of you he expected with the version of you that actually showed up. And when those two don't match, it creates a tension that stays in his mind longer than any conversation would have, because words can be dismissed, words can be argued with, words can be forgotten. But silence leaves room. It lingers. It echoes in the absence of explanation. It stays present in the things that were never said, in the reactions that never came, in the closure that was never given. And in that space, your silence continues to speak in ways that words never could. Your silence is not just about what you're choosing not to say. It's about what you're choosing to stand for. When you refuse to argue, refuse to beg, refuse to prove your worth to someone who has already made a decision about you, you are communicating something far more powerful than any words could ever express. You are showing self-respect, not in a loud performative way, not in a way that seeks validation or applause, but in a quiet, grounded way that speaks directly through your actions. Because the truth is, most people only understand self-respect in theory. They talk about knowing their worth. They post about it. They say the right things, but when they're faced with rejection, that understanding gets tested. That understanding gets tested. And in that moment, many people abandon their own standards just to hold on to someone who has already let go. They start negotiating, they start compromising. They start lowering the very boundaries they once claimed were non-negotiable. Not because they don't know better, but because the fear of losing someone feels stronger than the desire to honor themselves. But when you choose silence, you are choosing differently. You are choosing not to chase someone who has already stepped back. You are choosing not to convince someone to see what they couldn't recognize on their own. You are choosing not to shrink yourself just to fit into a space that was never fully yours to begin with. And that choice, that internal decision, is what makes your silence so powerful, because self-respect isn't about how loudly you defend yourself. It's about how calmly you walk away when you realize you're not being valued. It's about understanding that your worth is not up for debate, not up for negotiation, not dependent on someone else's ability to see it. And when you truly internalize that, your behavior changes. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop trying to control outcomes that are no longer yours to control. You stop seeking closure from people who are not capable of giving it. Instead, you move with intention. You move with clarity. You move with a sense of calm that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. And that calmness, that grounded energy is what people feel. It's what makes your silence heavy, because it's not filled with confusion or desperation. It's filled with certainty. When you don't respond to rejection with emotional chaos, it disrupts expectations. It forces the other person to see you differently. They may have expected tears, questions, maybe even anger. They may have expected you to hold on, to fight for the connection, to show them that they mattered enough to shake you. But when you don't do any of that, when you simply step back and accept what is, it creates a moment they didn't prepare for. And in that moment, your silence becomes a reflection of your standards. It shows that you don't chase what doesn't choose you. It shows that you don't stay where you not appreciated. It shows that you don't need to convince anyone to be in your life. And those are not just actions. Those are principles. Those are values that are being lived in real time. Becca, anyone can say they have standards when things are going well. Anyone can talk about boundaries when they're not being challenged. But real self-respect is revealed in moments of discomfort, in moments where it would be easier to go back, easier to explain, easier to hold on. And when you still choose yourself in those moments, that's when it becomes real. Your silence also protects your dignity. It prevents you from saying things you might later regret. It prevents you from over-explaining yourself to someone who has already decided not to listen. It prevents you from giving more of your energy to a situation that has already taken enough from you. And that protection is not weakness, it's wisdom. Because every time you chase someone who has rejected you, you send a message, not just to them, but to yourself. You reinforce the idea that your value is something that needs to be proven that your place in someone's life is something that needs to be earned through effort and persistence. And over time, that mindset erodes your confidence. It makes you question yourself. It makes you feel like you're not enough unless someone else confirms it. But when you choose silence, you interrupt that pattern. You send a different message. You show yourself that you are enough as you are, that you don't need to fight for a position in someone's life, that you don't need to beg for attention or affection. And that internal shift is where real confidence begins to grow, because confidence is not built by being chosen by others. It's built by choosing yourself, especially when it's difficult, especially when it hurts, especially when everything in you wants to reach out, but you decide not to. That restraint, that discipline, that ability to sit with your emotions without acting on them impulsively, that's strength. And that strength doesn't go unnoticed. It may not be acknowledged. It may not be acknowledged, edged out loud, but it's felt. Because there's a difference between someone who walks away because they're forced to, and someone who walks away because they refuse to stay where they're not valued. That difference shows in your energy, in your presence, and the way you carry yourself even in silence. When you don't argue, you remove yourself from unnecessary conflict. When you don't beg, you maintain your dignity. When you don't explain yourself repeatedly, you preserve your self-worth. And all of those things together create a version of you that is grounded, composed, and unshaken by someone else's inability to recognize your value. And the reality is, not everyone will understand your silence. Some people may misinterpret it. Some may think you didn't care. Some may think you moved on too quickly. But none of that changes what your silence actually represents, because self-respect is not about being understood by everyone. It's about being aligned with yourself. It's about knowing that you did not compromise your values for temporary value validation. It's about knowing that you did not abandon yourself just to keep someone else. It's about knowing that you handled the situation with integrity, even when it would have been easier to do otherwise. And over time, that consistency builds something unshakable within you. It builds trust in yourself. It builds a sense of identity that is not dependent on external approval. It builds a level of emotional stability that allows you to navigate future situations with more clarity and confidence. Because once you've experienced the power of choosing yourself in silence, you don't easily go back to chasing, explaining, or begging for validation. You start to recognize your value in a way that doesn't need to be constantly reaffirmed by others. You start to move differently, think differently, and respond differently, and that shift becomes a part of who you are. Not just something you do in one situation, but something that defines how you carry yourself moving forward. There's something powerful that happens in the space where you stop focusing on him and start focusing on yourself. It's quiet at first. It doesn't feel dramatic. There's no big announcement, no visible shift that the world immediately recognizes. But internally, everything begins to change, because the moment you stop waiting, stop checking, stop wondering what he's doing or thinking, you reclaim energy that you didn't even realize you had been giving away. And that energy doesn't just disappear. It redirects. It moves back towards you, towards your growth, your healing, your clarity. All the attention that was once tied to his actions, his responses, his presence, now has somewhere else to go. And when it comes back to you, it starts building something slowly, steadily, without noise, without pressure. At first, it might feel unfamiliar. You might catch yourself thinking about him out of habit. You might feel the urge to check his social media, to replay conversations, to revisit moments that no longer serve you. That's normal. That's part of the process. Because when you've been emotionally invested, your mind doesn't just switch off overnight. But the difference now is that you're not feeding those thoughts the same way. You're not acting on every impulse. You're letting those moments pass without turning them into actions. So, whichever does it, and in that restraint, you begin to grow, not in a way that's loud or visible to everyone else, but in a way that is deeply personal. You start to understand yourself better. You start to see where you may have overextended, where you may have ignored your own needs, where you may have tried too hard to hold onto something that wasn't aligned with you. And that awareness is not meant to blame, or it's meant to strengthen you, because growth is not about becoming someone completely different. It's about becoming more of who you actually are, without the layers of doubt, insecurity, or external validation that may have been clouding your judgment before. It's about reconnecting with your standards, your values, your sense of self, and building from there. While he may expect you to be stuck, you're actually moving, maybe not visibly, maybe not in a way that he can track or measure, but you are moving forward. You're healing in ways that don't require his acknowledgement. You're rebuilding your confidence in ways that don't depend on his opinion. You're creating a life that doesn't revolve around whether or not he comes back. And that's the part that changes everything. Because when someone thinks they have a certain place in your life, they assume that place will remain available. They assume that if they ever decide to return, things will still be the same. That you'll still be there, still open, still willing to pick up where things left off. But what they don't account for is growth. They don't account for the fact that time, when used intentionally, changes people. As you continue to focus on yourself, your perspective begins to shift. The things that once felt so important start to lose their weight. The connection that once felt irreplaceable starts to look different. Not because it didn't matter, but because you've evolved beyond the version of yourself that was attached to it in the same way. You begin to see things with more clarity. You recognize patterns you may have overlooked before. You understand what you truly want and what you're no longer willing to accept. And that clarity becomes a filter. It shapes your decisions, your boundaries, your expectations moving forward. So when he eventually looks back, whether it's out of curiosity, or simply a moment of reflection, he's not looking at the same person he once knew. He's looking at someone who has grown, someone who has changed, someone who no longer carries the same emotional availability that was once so easily accessible. And that realization doesn't come from anything you said. It comes from everything you did in silence, from the way you redirected your energy, from the way you chose yourself without needing to announce it, from the way you allowed time to transform you instead of waiting for time to bring him back. Because growth creates distance, not just physical distance, but emotional distance. The more you invest in yourself, the less attached you become to what no longer aligns with you. The more you build your own life, the less space there is for something that once disrupted your peace. And that shift is not something that can be reversed overnight. When he expects to find the same version of you, he's expecting someone who no longer exists. He's expecting the version of you that was more available, more accommodating, more willing to overlook certain things just to maintain the connection. But that version of you has been replaced by someone who has learned, someone who is learned, someone who has raised their standards without needing to explain why. And that's where the impact truly hits. Because now it's not just about what he lost, it's about what he can no longer access. It's about the realization that the door he once walked away from is not standing open in the same way. Not because you're trying to prove a point, not because you're holding on to resentment, but because you genuinely move forward. And moving forward doesn't always mean you've forgotten. It doesn't mean the past didn't matter. It simply means you're no longer living in it. You're no longer defining yourself by it. You're no longer waiting for it to come back. That shift creates a version of you that is grounded in the present, focused on the future, and no longer tied to what could have been. And that version of you carries a different energy, one that doesn't seek validation, doesn't chase attention, doesn't depend on someone else's presence to feel complete. And when that energy is felt, even from a distance, it changes the way you are perceived. It changes the way you are remembered. It changes the way someone reflects on the connection they once had with you. Because now, instead of seeing someone who stayed, they see someone who grew. Instead of seeing someone who waited, they see someone who moved on with purpose and intention, and that realization settles in slowly, in quiet moments, in thoughts that come without warning, in the awareness that time didn't keep you in the same place, that life continued to shape you into someone different, someone stronger, someone no longer available in the way you once were.